So you had a lot of these communists in the OSS were not allowed into the CIA once the CIA was created, but they went into the State Department and they became professors and they trained new generations of our diplomats and spies. And so they were able to inject their ideology into our foreign policy doctrine and into the whole containment strategy. And sort of this is how we got to where we got.
Hello, Culminators. Thank you once again for joining me. Today is one of those categories of we've been following each other for years online. I've never had a chance to chat before. So I'm going to get to know J. Michael Waller. That's, by the way, how you know somebody is old FBI. If they have that J. Edgar Hoover, G. Gordon Liddy styling. Michael Waller, incredible background, one of the most valuable follows on Twitter, a great American, obviously. And he's got a new book. It's about nothing less than the big, or you might say the 500-pound, maybe it's a big 500-pound gorilla in the room. Big Intel. What a problem. And I've got some questions that I'm hoping no one else has asked him. Some an original thinker. Let's see. Michael, thanks for coming. How are you doing?
Good to be with you, Ron.
Here's your problem. Here's your problem, Michael. I'm going to tell you your problem because I've solved all the problems myself. Here's what your Twitter profile looks like. Okay, like you're a low key guy. You're not a self-promoter guy. You're not a flamboyant guy. I get that. Your background would not make that something that you could be. I guess, on the other hand, Hal Sutphin kind of pulled it off. But all right, this pencil sketch of you, you lose it. You lose that. You don't pop out. But every tweet, folks, every tweet is insightful. And why not? He's senior analyst for strategy of the Center for Security Policy. Okay, we'll have to ask him if that's something other than his basement. He's got the book. Michael, how'd you get here? You're not one of these guys who became an expert on everything just by being on Twitter, right?
No, it started when I was a kid in New Hampshire. Growing up, I got involved in the anti-nuclear movement against the Seabrook nuclear power plant. But it was purely because they had a 6-foot pipe running water from the cooling part of the reactor out to sea, right where I go fishing with my dad and my grandpa. So that's why I was riled up about it. But the more I got involved in it, these professionals came in from California and they started picking out these 15, 16-year-old kids who they thought would make leaders. And they grabbed me and it was all very exciting. And but after a while, they put me through what I later realized were struggle sessions. And they said,
we're talking about the late 80s here?
Late 70s.
Late 70s, okay.
Yeah. So this is like Jane Fonda and the China Syndrome period.
Right, okay.
Everybody's
I'm in high
all
school,
scared.
and you're out of college?
No, I'm in high school.
You're in high school also.
Old.
You're my age also.
Oh, okay.
I'm 62. I'm 61.
Oh, I'll be 62 in a little bit.
Okay.
Yeah, so we're the same age.
Right. So, okay. So I'm in high school having a normal, high school of the 70s experience. You're already an activist. I mean, I was already reactionary, but you're already an activist. Starts out with the fishing, and then you fall in with this group of commies.
Real commies, because they said, why do you want to be involved? And I very sincerely told them why. And they said, this is not what we're about. We're out to overthrow American capitalism. So,
and you're just a high school kid. You're not particularly ideologically based at the time. In fact,
I was sort of Republican leaning, but I didn't have any real worldview. I just liked fishing.
Kind of like a person of New Hampshire in the 1970s.
Yeah, exactly. So that really blew me away. So I realized right then I was a communist dupe.
Oh, okay. So I was wondering how that sentence was going to end. I realized right then, this is terrible. I've got to learn about what's happening to our country. Or I realized, okay, I'm in. So, okay, I'm in was your reaction.
No, okay, I'm going to screw all you people for the rest of my life. I'm just going to go after you.
Oh, okay. So it was the first answer.
Started.
I'm not a
Yeah,
communist. Oh, in other words, if I'm hanging out with them, I'm a communist, and I don't want to be a communist.
right. Because I was brought in idealistically, but I was duped by the communists into going in.
Idealistically, not ideologically.
Right. I just didn't want boiling water being put in the place where we'd go cod fishing. That's all.
Okay, so there you are in high school. Now you've got a mission.
Yeah. I've got to expose these people.
So
Lots of good
what
people are
did you
caught up in this terrible stuff. So let's expose it, bring it forward, um, infiltrate the groups, disrupt the groups, and that got me on my way.
you're 17 years old and this is what you're working out in your head.
Yeah.
All right, so how did that go? What did you do?
Well, not much in high school because this was a process where I didn't just declare right then and there. It was just, okay, I'm not having anything to do with you guys. And then when I realized, wait, these guys didn't just oppose the Vietnam War, which had just ended a few years earlier, they supported the enemy. They supported the communists. They supported Chairman Mao and the Soviet Union.
Were these native New Hampshireites?
Some of them were, yeah, but most of them were Boston transplants, and then the organizers were transplants from California.
I mean, we're getting here at what happened to New England over the last generation.
Yeah.
And New England has, you've got Harvard, you got Boston. It's always been traditionally liberal, but that it became blue from stem to stern, and so and became such a breeding ground for so much subversion in this country. These people, that was a mission that they obviously were undertaking already 40, 50 years ago.
Yeah. And
So you stuck a pin in it.
Well, sorry.
No, I'm sorry. So you're actually, I interrupted you. You were going to say something else. What were we talking about?
Yeah, in that time in the 70s, you had people from New Jersey and New York and Connecticut and Massachusetts coming to New Hampshire because there was no state income tax, no state sales tax, and it was a nice place to live, and there was very little crime, and it was great. But they brought their stupid voting attitudes with them.
How many generations was your family in New Hampshire?
Well, we settled when it was still part of Massachusetts. So we first came over from Europe in 1621. It was the ship right after the Mayflower. So
Why don't you sound at all like a Yankee, though? I mean, I'm hearing a real standard Midwestern pronunciation here.
I can talk New Hampshire if you want me to.
Yeah, yeah.
Maybe not.
All right, fine. Yeah. Okay, I get it.
So we were among the early settlers of Plymouth Colony, and then
Wow.
Massachusetts Bay Company and so forth. So been around for quite a bit.
Yeah.
But the transplants came in and they brought their attitudes with them, and they transformed our states.
So these are transplants, and this is a story that we've seen played out throughout the country. They escaped high tax jurisdictions to live in a place that was unspoiled by the policies, economic and otherwise, that they were fleeing, with the intention to turn these places into what they had left.
Yeah, what they'd escaped from.
All right. So it is. So you stuck a pin in it. You said, okay, I'm not gonna hang out with these guys anymore, but now I gotta go to college. I gotta. So what'd you go to school?
So this was the fall of 1980. Okay, so you'd remember this time, freshman year, Jimmy Carter's president. Now, before going to college, I went to the town hall, and even though everybody knows everybody there, you still have to show your ID to register to vote. I registered to vote and wasn't old enough to register in the New Hampshire primary, where I would have voted for Reagan, but I was old enough to vote in the general. So I voted absentee from my dorm at George Washington University, which is 3 blocks from the White House. And the Reagan inaugural parade broke up on our campus. So it was a very exciting time to be there. But that freshman semester, I interned for my U.S. Senator Gordon Humphrey, who was a solid conservative. And through working in his office, I just did the DC thing, just started networking with everybody. So that got me involved in all of this kind of work. And this Senator Gordon Humphrey was a solid anti-communist, solid pro-U.S. Let's take down the Soviet Union along with Reagan's whole agenda. And so I came up through that movement at that particular time.
What'd you major in? One of those politics or foreign affairs kind of things?
Well, exactly. So I'd been an exchange student to Argentina, so I thought, well, I'll do Latin American studies. But of course, Latin American studies programs then and now were just full of Marxists and hysterical women, and so we're not going to get anywhere.
Or
So I
hysterical women and other Marxists.
yeah, right, exactly. So I switched to Soviet studies, and it was a great department they had there because you had, a KGB defector who was a professor, Vladimir Petrov, and you had some really, really solid people who had either lived under communism or sworn
So
to.
those were the days, the great days of Soviet studies. At the same time, I was sitting riveted in my seat listening to Stephen Cohen, the great Sovietologist, at Princeton. And I was a de facto Soviet. My major was economics, but I took Soviet style economies, which was the biggest whitewash. And it was so, I mean, the guy wasn't a commie. He just was, hey, we do it this way, they do it that way. But he acknowledged how poorly they did it. But, of course, on Solzhenitsyn and Soviet, I mean, the whole Cold War moment. So that's, yes, I mean, that would, and it looked like that was a field that was going to last forever.
Yeah, yeah. There was no, almost nobody was imagining a life without a Soviet Union, but the Reagan team was. It was, and people found it scary. The establishment found it scary. The Bush Republicans found it terrifying. But the Reagan people were like, yeah, these regimes don't need to last forever. Let's kick the legs out from under it.
So you started networking. You're in Washington, so you started kind of. Were you going places? Were you meeting people, or did you meet people on campus and they then introduced you? Because I mean, this is kind of a dream for someone inclined our way. And if I had been with it enough, maybe if I'd been attempted maybe if the commies had attempted to recruit me, perhaps I would have made similar choices. But how'd you know where to go? How'd you know who to talk to? I mean, it sounds very easy now, especially in the age of social media, where I can DM with extraordinarily famous people. How did you get? How'd you get inside?
Well, it helped having a dorm that's 3 blocks from the White House because you're just in the
Oh,
middle of
did
it.
you take Russian language?
I did, but I spoke it very poorly. So
No,
because
but the
I'd
point
already
is
done
that
Spanish and Portuguese, so
but once
Russian.
you registered for Russian,
Uh-huh.
you're a different creature.
Oh yeah.
In terms of recruiting options and foreign service and CIA, all the things. Okay, please
Yeah.
continue with the story because I'm not. This is great. I'm just eating it up,
Oh,
living vicariously. I'm having the '80s career that I probably really would have wanted to have.
it's funny because sometimes I think I really wish I went into some other kind of work where I had a really nice, dependable income stream or something. But
Yeah,
no,
me
really, these
well.
types of
Oh, so that's
adventures
another
are
thing we
quite.
share. Okay.
So you go around. You're an intern, 18 years old. You're always looking for free food or whatever else. So back then in the Senate, you could just had the run of the place if you were a kid. You go to every single reception, and there's always some lobbyist uh, having receptions there, and the best receptions were
Ah,
often the defense lobbyists. So you'd have John Tower and Scoop Jackson and Strom Thurmond there, and you'd meet some staffer like Frank Gaffney. Think, wow. So that's where Frank and I first met about 40 years ago. He doesn't remember it, but then he was on Senate Armed Services Committee, and you just meet these people and you collect their business cards, and you keep contact with them. Usually they'll ignore you because you're just a kid and who are you? But a lot of them are going to be good to you. Angelo Codavilla being another one on the Senate Intelligence Committee. He actually took the time to mentor young people who he thought had a lot of interest and a lot of drive and a lot of sincerity and wanted to go places. He even liked the insincere ones so he could fillet them. But that's a different story. But you keep doing these networking, and there was a guy in Humphrey's office. This was the fall of 1980, and he was Humphrey's policy director, and he'd always be on the phone like this, so you couldn't tell what he was hearing. But he was 2 cubicles away, and he was interested in youth politics, and so he spent a lot of time talking to me. And then the day after Reagan's election, he was gone. Prior to disappearing, he told me, "Go to CPAC 81, go there and network." and just keep
CPAC
networking. That
81.
CPAC 81. And Reagan was there. Morton Blackwell was the Senate staffer. He was a wonderful organizer and a trainer of youth activists and journalists. And so he's the one who then disappeared by going on to Reagan's transition team and then to the White House. So then I immediately had, as an 18-year-old, a contact in the White House whose job was to liaise with political supporters outside.
So you stepped up to the opportunity there.
Yeah.
So what happened after college?
Well, first during college was I got involved in student journalism, and that's what set me on my path after college. Wasn't so much the classroom experience, but the other kinds of experiences, and in student journalism. So, in working with the Reagan White House as a kid, I was now at the College Republican National Committee and working at their office doing Reagan's national security portfolio, and then Young Americans for Freedom, and then had a chance to go out with the Contras in Nicaragua as a student journalist. So that's what really pushed me along. It was not institutional work; it was personal context that one makes, and then personal initiative. And that's where I was.
So you went to El Salvador?
Yeah, I went first to Nicaragua with the Contras.
Oh, the Contras. Okay.
Who were fighting they were the guerrillas who were fighting the communist regime in Nicaragua, and they were being backed by the CIA. I didn't know that my initial work was funded. Well, part of it was funded by private people and groups. Others, I just got walking around money in $500 envelopes.
But you didn't know about the Iran Contra stuff until the rest of us did.
Thing that you might like to know, the Contras were getting these used, beat up Soviet weapons by the truckload, and I was with the Contras at the time, and the truck driver had too much to drink. He was a local guy, and it was a truck that they beat up old truck that they'd used to haul coffee beans, and like a 5-ton truck. And so I drove the truck for him, but it was all loaded with AK-47s and mortars and ammunition and all this other stuff. It was all really beat up, and I got to look at it, and it had Arabic markings on the stocks and painted on them and carving in them and so forth. And I later learned that this was from when Ariel Sharon ran the PLO into the sea in Operation Peace for Galilee in 1982. Those arms ended up in Honduras, and then me, just this in my little Forrest Gump experience, ended up driving one of the trucks to bring the arms to the Contra camp.
Very cool. I think we could definitely eat up the entire 45 minutes talking about your adventures. Maybe we'll have to do it another time. You end up going into journalism.
Yeah, student journalism. It was more advocacy journalism than straight journalism.
Okay, you're still at college.
Yeah.
But after graduation, did you go into an agency?
No, I never did, because as Angelo Codavilla told me, with my temperament, he said, "You will hate them and they will hate you."
Because
they're bureaucracies, and they are process minded, not mission oriented. And Angelo and others saw me as a mission oriented kind of guy, where I just wanted to do things, and I could figure out how to do things at low cost with a high impact. And of course, that's not something that bureaucracies do.
All right. So then what was the move for you after college?
So the move was all privately funded stuff in the anti-Soviet movement, working now with Europeans, with Israelis, with Egyptians, with people from China, including some old timers who had fought Mao back in World War II and during the Chinese Revolution, and young and old. And so the older ones mentored us, and the younger ones, we did stuff together. And I ended up hitching up with those in Europe to infiltrate and disrupt Soviet front organizations. This was just a lot of fun. It didn't pay anything at all, but it networked us to what became, or what actually we didn't know at the time already was, a private intelligence network.
So in those days, there was a hub of that kind of activity around Jesse Helms.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
Because those guys eventually reached out to me, and I made at Princeton, they tried to, I was the Brilliant Pebbles guy.
Okay.
Yeah.
Missile defense.
And people were pulling back before it got really ugly. All people did was pull down my announcements. Oh, and it was peace through strength. It was peace through strength. That's right. I got some of that action. And I was the campus coordinator for the New Jersey Jewish Coalition, which was, of course, was the Republican Jewish Coalition for Reagan Bush '84. So we might have to just sit down and have dinner to talk all this through, because I don't want to say the names of any of the people who probably don't want their
to get them in
names.
trouble.
All right, okay, so you just been doing all this really cool stuff, but you do eventually start writing, right? I mean,
Yeah, so I did work infiltrating first communist groups on my own. These are the support arms for the El Salvador guerrillas. This is
and
the
of course,
U.S. out of El
before the
Salvador.
internet, it's much easier to just show up and you're not a known name, and they don't, like, in other words, you couldn't just run someone's picture or name through something. You could just show up and tell a story.
Yeah, yeah, and I just went and just hung out with them, and I could talk with them. And hey, I've been to El Salvador too. I didn't say I was going with the guys who were, you know, filling your guys full of lead, but that was not, you know. So I'm. This was what the North Vietnamese called their third current of revolution, meaning the first current of revolution is the fight in their own country, the communist revolution. The second was the Soviet bloc in China that were aiding them, and the third current of revolution was the anti-war movement and the solidarity movement in what they called the imperial power. So that was the anti-Vietnam War movement, but we see it now with these so-called pro-Palestinian blockages of traffic and airports and bridges and seaports and so forth. This is the Hamas or the Iranian regime's third current of revolution in the Western countries, to show that not just to protest, but to actually show that they can on command be in a position to sabotage logistics and who knows what else.
And it's also a pen test. You know, I mean, they're gauging how much they can get away with, and I'm sure they're not disappointed. And they certainly know that every major blue jurisdiction will let them go as far as they want, and there'll be certainly nothing in the nature of an investigation, but virtually no arrests or even official resistance. But again, a topic. I mean, I just wish I could do a series with you. Okay. I want to bring us up to something closer to what prepares you to write the book. Although I think I already heard one thing, which was that you learned early on that intelligence agencies, the personnel may be patriotic, they may be anti-communist, but they are first and foremost certainly post Wild Bill Donovan, okay, in our era. I mean, you were talking to the guys who knew Donovan back in the '80s, but by the 21st century, we're several generations in, and these guys they're a cadre of professional intelligence people who are moving away from human intelligence towards technology, and are beginning to get very connected to the political organs in a kind of a different way from what preceded them.
Yeah.
So segue me into that so that we can, spend a little bit of time talking about the book.
Well, what happened with our intelligence services, and really it happened under Bill Donovan, where he was so fixated on just fighting the immediate enemy, which was his job, that he could hire anybody who could help. Well, that meant, and you need to do that, but you also have to think, if you're bringing in Communist Party members and Soviet agents and Soviet supporters into your intelligence services to fight the Nazis, that's all well and good if we need those skill sets, but as long as we control them. It's that when they control us and they're trying to get an end game favorable to Stalin after Hitler.
And what happened and very few people have an appreciation for how much of that happened in China.
Yeah.
In the 40s.
Yeah.
And it seems, I'm sure, like a good idea at the time.
Yeah.
But the question that of the generation before you and me, who lost China, becomes very, people understand that, as you point out, that's when that compromising process began then. And also that there was a very close cooperation during World War II when the CIA, OSI, was in the process of the predecessor of the CIA, was being born. It was being nursed at the teat of MI5 and other British intelligence organizations, which were packed with commies.
Mm-hmm. And their action officer in Washington, Dickie Ellis, who was the number 2 at the embassy under he's most famous as his name was Stevenson, was a man called Intrepid. Intrepid was his code name, but the one handling the OSS day to day himself was a double agent for Stalin. So that means the guardian of American intelligence from the British. So we have 2 foreign influences on setting up our intelligence. We have British intelligence, but then a Soviet double agent helping build on him and set it up. And then another Soviet agent like Kim Philby mentoring really solid people like James Angleton, who was vital to fighting the communists in the Cold War. But this is a whole, at least Angleton wised up to it, but a lot of others did not. So you had a lot of these communists in the OSS were not allowed into the CIA once the CIA was created, but they went into the State Department and they became professors and they trained new generations of our diplomats and spies. And so they were able to inject their ideology into our foreign policy doctrine and into the whole containment strategy. And sort of, this is how we got to where we got.
You cover this in the book, right? You familiarize people with this history, because that alone would be sufficient for people to read this book, because you don't hear this. And, we're still in a world of 50 intelligence, senior intelligence community, personnel have signed. Like, there's this cultural deference to people by virtue of the fact that they're in, that they've been one of these intelligence agencies. Okay, please continue.
No, and it's easy to be in awe of them or to defer to them. I can understand why the public would and why others would, but really,
sure,
when you see it up close, if you thought of it as just a secret State Department, it loses a lot of its mystique. But that's really what the CIA is. It's just a secret State Department. The mentality is very similar in most cases.
And presidents had this same they made the same error that Donovan did with respect to their relationships with the agencies too. Eisenhower was suspicious as hell, like all regular Army guys were. And yet, when they told him what kind of intelligence they could get if they took a bunch of Air Force pilots and made them CIA pilots and flew U-2s over Russia and Cuba, he couldn't resist. He couldn't resist. And it seems to me that historically, also JFK, supposedly the reason the CIA killed him was because he loved to play with the toys, but he also knew that they were subversive to good government. And, I don't want to over idealize John F. Kennedy, but clearly presidents have always been suspicious of this alternative power center, as and yet they can't resist using it, and therefore they're compromised ultimately.
Yeah. Well, if you recognize it as a tool, it's a tool for the use of a president. Its purpose is to inform the president using secret intelligence of everything around the world so that he can make the proper decisions. And then it's a covert action tool for the president to conduct operations short of military action. It all makes sense, but as long as the presidents view it as a tool, the thing is, as Chuck Schumer warned, of all people, when Donald Trump came in and said, I'm going to clean house, I'm going to get rid of this abusive, secret squirrel stuff. And Chuck Schumer, he wasn't even threatening Trump. There's a lot of people say, if you look back, he was almost warning.
Making an observation.
Any president who goes after the CIA and the FBI, those agencies have 6 ways from Sunday to get back at you. So here you have Chuck Schumer saying that even he is a Democrat or Trump is a Republican in 2 different branches of government don't have any power to rein in these agencies.
So let's get up to the Church Committee. Let's explain how it came to be that there was an assertion, a brief moment that lulled us into a great deal of complacency in the 70s when Congress asserted its power when the non-shadow government asserted its power to oversee the conduct of intelligence.
That was a really big deal, because until the aftermath of the Watergate scandal and the collapse in Vietnam and all of this, the cultural upheaval in our country, until that point, Congress didn't want to assert itself against the intelligence community. Senior senators thought they didn't have a right to know certain things, so they just gave it a blank check. Now, from the 50s up to the 70s, so for 25 years, a little more than that, the agencies had pretty much a blank check. So it's after all of this, when you have leaks coming out, you have memoirs coming out by or all sorts of writings coming out by former intelligence people. You had the left-wing radicals broke into an FBI headquarters or FBI field office several years earlier. The whole collapse of Vietnam, the realization that so much of it was based on a lie, and the cynicism of society. Finally, though, something would come out of it where assertive senators said, you know what, we're going to hold these people accountable. We're going to get to the bottom of all this. So you had a left-wing, very far left senator, Frank Church, who took the lead on it, but he had as a cooperative witness CIA Director Bill Colby, who was a devoted, loyal CIA man, if you view it as a fraternity, like they view themselves as, going all the way back to the OSS. And he testified at about 50 congressional hearings, and he brought out a lot of material to expose CIA mistakes, CIA wrongdoing, CIA excesses over the years, sometimes with presidential approval and sometimes not. So that's what the Church Committee was. They had 130 plus professional staffers and investigative counsel. And
did that begin during Nixon, or was that during Ford?
That was during Ford. That was after Nixon had resigned.
But I do think that one of the things that made it possible was that the executive was in Republican hands.
Yes.
And Democrats had an interest in removing tools from the executive. And at that time, especially after Nixon, there was a lot of public political appeal in doing so.
Yeah.
So
and
there were
Soviet active measures campaign going on to discredit the CIA, because if the Soviets could rip apart the CIA, they rip apart one of the most important tools that we have. Right after, they were also going after, you mentioned Brilliant Pebbles in that program. They had a huge active measures campaign a decade later or less to make sure we didn't have any missile defense system.
Well, that's right. Let me, an important point that I think we need to make. One of the things you often hear people, we all joke about all the things that the CIA and especially the FBI miss, gigantic screw ups. But of course, we don't necessarily know what they don't miss. They're not, or at least I would imagine over the two generations of their, or three generations of the CIA's history, it was a pretty effective tool. It did accomplish a lot.
Yeah. We can't expect perfection out of any human endeavor. There's going to be screw ups. There's going to be things that weren't seen. And that's kind of normal. So you factor all of that in, and people can say, well, the CIA has a terrible track record in this. They also had a great track record in many cases. And some of the things that have been portrayed as terrible failures or terrible wrongdoing were actually great strategic successes for us. And they were good for our country. So we have to kind of figure all of that in. The thing is, though, there's this mystique that, well, if it's secret, if the material was gathered in a secret way, in a clandestine way, then it must really be true. But if it's found in an open way, it's probably not true, or there's probably something secret that makes the public stuff pale in comparison. What we learned along the way was some of the best stuff is gained privately, whether it's through real journalism or it's through private groups going in and infiltrating or adventuring or having disciplined what we call participatory research operations, where you actually go in to infiltrate or to purloin the way an intelligence person would, but you're doing it as a private citizen.
So you're talking about intelligence gathering. Okay.
Right. And then analyzing it the right way.
But I mean, there are two, is it fair to say there are two main things the CIA does, right? Intelligence gathering and operations.
Yeah, the intelligence gathering and the analysis of the information that was gathered. So that's on the
That's one, right?
one side, and then the other side is operations,
which can include overthrowing governments, compromising politicians, all the cool stuff. And it, let's fast forward just because of time. You have the church committee reforms, which a lot of people at the time felt perhaps went too far, but there was an appetite for that at the time.
Yeah.
40 years later, here we are. Tell us where we are.
Here we are. Well, what you had was a wholesale loss of some really seasoned, proper thinking. I mean, a lot of them were Democrats, but they were proper thinking in terms of what the national interest was, what the country was all about, what our founding principles were. They were either forced out or retired in demoralization. And then you had this.
You mean on the political side?
Yeah,
on the political side or on the staff side?
On the staff side, so professional CIA intelligence operatives and analysts and managers. So then you had this terrible case of demoralization. So Bill Casey comes in under Reagan and he tries to rejuvenate it, but there's a resistance inside to him because he's saying we have a mission to go after the Soviet Union. And the ruling mentality in there was, no, we're just neutral analysts. We have to be as dispassionate as possible.
And by then we're thinking we're basically twins of the State Department.
Yeah.
So it's about détente and stability and a bipolar world. And let's not rock the boat. Not necessarily a cynical concept that, listen, if the Soviet Union is out of business, then we're out of business too, and we'll have nothing to do. But rather, that's not a practical goal.
Right. And also they were of the mentality that there's always going to be a Soviet Union. It's dangerous to think of a world without a Soviet Union because it means we'd be making it happen. That would cause a nuclear war or instability, or as you just said, it might cost us our careers. Because imagine with the collapse of the Soviet Union, how many Sovietologists didn't have the work that they had invested their lives in any further. And of course, that doesn't mean, and this is one of the problems that we have. We can't think in many different planes at the same time. We've got the Soviet enemy on this side. We've got the rise of communist China here. We've got the rise of jihadis here. We've got Shiite extremism and Sunni extremism, and we think that they're two different things that can never work together.
Well, the rise of Islam also really throws a monkey wrench into the bipolar stable world also, right?
Yeah, because it has to be stable. It's like this mantra you're seeing now across the world, but especially in the State Department and the Biden administration, but it goes to the Uniparty as well. Israel must not escalate. They've just been attacked full bore by the Iranians, and now, but it's Israel that has to be stopped from escalating this further. That's not just bias against Israel. It is bias against Israel, but it's also the default point because you saw them doing the same thing with Ukraine. Oh, don't hit those Russian oil terminals. That will be provocative.
You don't want to make them angry. People who are in the process of waging war against you, you don't want to make them angry.
Right. Can't do that, but we can't let you win, but we can't let the bad guys lose. We just go from crisis to crisis to crisis, and it's the same kind of mentality. This is way different from the OSS mission of let's wipe out the enemy.
So what happens in the 90s?
So in the 90s, you had this influx of a huge influx of new CIA and other intelligence community employees, a lot of people straight out of college, and now it's a merger with high tech. And so you've got high tech coming out of Silicon Valley, which means bringing San Francisco values into the intelligence community from below. And these bureaucratic people who stayed on, who really were not mission oriented.
So the influx is because they need technical know-how.
They need technical know-how and other
and contacts in the finance world. I mean, those
linguistic skill sets, cultural skill sets, all of these other things too. But they're doing it in large, very large numbers, so they can't bet for quality anymore. And you're going to have people who were born, let's say, in the Middle East or Pakistan or someplace else who don't have American founding principles as their bedrock, and they're brought in, and then they start setting up inside with activist groups employee resource groups, or in the CIA, it's agency resource groups. And these are like Communist Party cells of different groups with different grievances against American society. So now they start networking among themselves from below. And when Bush came, George W. Bush came with the proper intentions, I think, but to centralize the FBI, to centralize the whole intelligence community under a giant directorate of national intelligence, to have the huge Department of Homeland Security and then the Patriot Act and everything else, created a super state security system as our country has never seen from the top down. So when Obama came in to fundamentally transform America, he did that with the intelligence community, and he did it by imposing his cultural Marxist agenda and DEI and everything else from the top down, with people like James Clapper, who, he had sheltered that Cuban spy in the DIA back when he was DIA director. He probably didn't know she was a Cuban spy, but he did know that she was a militant left winger, and he sheltered her and a bunch of other ones. And then John Brennan, the CIA director, who was the unrepentant, Gus Hall voter for the U.S. Communist Party.
All right, let's stop
right before he went into the CIA.
Everyone in the world who doesn't intimately know these institutions, how does a guy who is a communist become a high-ranking director of an intelligence agency? What are we missing?
Well, we're missing a lot. The facts aren't missing. It's just public awareness is not missing, because that was viewed as a youthful indiscretion. But it was only 3 years before he was recruited into the CIA. And he's only a couple years older than we are. So the CIA, even back then, was welcoming freshly minted Communist Party voters who had voted for a Soviet agent to become president of our country.
Now, meanwhile,
it's not like he turned around and said, gee, that was a dumb thing to do. Let's learn a lesson from this. Let's learn how the KGB and the Soviets and others exploit young people in America to do stupid things and to vote for something that would wipe out the country. He never, ever did that in his career, not even in his memoir, where he acknowledged this.
I just saw a quote. I wish I could remember who it was from. People think we learn from our mistakes, but we learn from reflection on our mistakes. These people were never held accountable for their mistakes, so nothing was learned. Let's take a second to detour. The FBI, meanwhile, is a separate culture. In fact, one of the reforms of the Church Committee, actually, no, this was pre-church. This was during the Hoover era. Well, no, Hoover lived into that era, but I remember during the Nixon presidency, CIA, it was learned that the CIA had been involved in monitoring the anti-war movement, and they were not supposed to do domestic spying. And a wall was supposed to have been built between the CIA and the FBI. FBI has always been a different culture. FBI agents and CIA agents don't like each other traditionally. It's a different fraternity. How does the FBI change during this period?
The FBI was always very different culturally. It was more conservative, not in a political sense, but in a cultural sense. So J. Edgar Hoover, for example, was a New Dealer. He was close to President Franklin Roosevelt, but he had that old-fashioned American values, American conservative values that he brought with him, because he was always anti-Marxist, anti-communist, and he knew what they were doing to infiltrate our society at every level, in education, in entertainment, in the churches, in unions, and throughout our culture and politics. So he was always warning against this. So the FBI ethos was built around that and protecting our society from that, until about the 1970s, when it just became straight law enforcement. But then after 9/11, it became a domestic intelligence service with police powers. Very, very different, something that we've never had before, even though people can argue, as I did in Big Intel, that Hoover began hunting subversives. I mean, his first job was to hunt down foreign Marxists, communists, and anarchists and deport them all to Russia. It was a great job.
And then when you get the Homeland Security and this centralization and integration, that wall that had existed between CIA and FBI is now lowered, right?
It's lowered, and it's combined. But when you politicize it, you're searching for enemies. And so when you have an agency that's searching for enemies, searching for terrorists, okay, now there aren't that many terrorists, let's recall it violent extremists. And now let's say, people who are prone to become violent extremists. That means people we don't like. That means people like you and me.
Because we're always looking for the next Oswald. Because in retrospect, if anyone would have been paying attention to Oswald, he's running back and forth to Cuba. He tries to defect to the Soviet Union. He's a trained sharpshooter. This guy's trouble. So if we can identify a Lee Harvey Oswald, humor me, okay? I'm gonna go with Oswald being the lone gun assassin of JFK, okay? If we could identify that guy in advance, now maybe not so much Sirhan, because that might offend someone if we start monitoring Muslim Marxists. Let's talk about what the state of play is now and why you're able to call the book. The subtitle of the book is How the CIA and FBI Went from Cold War Heroes to Deep State Villains. To some extent, we have discussed that now, but how are they deep state villains? What's happened?
It really hurt to have that subtitle because the publisher put that on. And I said, I don't like deep state and I don't like villains. And they said, okay, come up with better words. And after 3 months, I couldn't come up with better words. So I said, okay, keep it. But it's really true. They went from defending our country, and it's not just to defend the territory of our country or the people who live within this big piece of real estate called the United States of America. It's to defend American values and American founding principles and the Western traditions on which our constitutional way of life is based. And they abandoned that.
But they abandoned that, but they didn't abandon the toolkit or the need to keep busy and to keep justifying their existence.
That's what makes them villainous. And the fact that they are not accountable in terms of, the Senate can't hold them accountable. The House can't and won't hold them accountable. The courts aren't holding them accountable.
I mean, gosh, we could do a whole an hour on FISA alone.
Yeah.
And the complete failure of the judiciary to do anything about this.
Complete failure. And then they have a fraternity where the worst crime you can commit in the FBI is to embarrass the FBI. So you have a few whistleblowers who have come out. They've had their lives destroyed through administrative process, where the FBI says the punishment is the process, or the process is the punishment. We will just, we're not going to fire you. We're going to suspend you without pay and without insurance. And you all have young families. We're not going to let you get another job because you're still on the FBI payroll, and you cannot be fired from the FBI because then you won't ever get another job once we let you. I mean, they're finding all these administrative means to destroy these people. So it's no wonder that more whistleblowers aren't coming out.
Could any president do anything to fix this?
Sure.
What could be done?
If you have a president with a unified team, with a strategy, with a plan, and with a list of which Obama executive orders and Biden ones to repeal and which ones to put in their place, all pre-written, it's much more than just shifting the people at the very top. You have to pull out all the executive orders in place, and then you have to abolish positions inside the system. If you can't fire these officials, you can abolish their positions. So let's say an executive order to abolish all DEI positions in the federal government. That would leave every single person responsible for DEI without a federal job anymore. They would be out of the federal workforce, and no one else would dare to go near it because their positions would be abolished too. That's one way to start it. Another thing that can be done, because the FBI was set up by a memorandum from an attorney general, there's no statute that set up the FBI. It's just a bureau. So it's a 1908 memorandum. So you just get another memorandum and say, we're going to take the crime fighting element of the FBI and transfer it to the U.S. Marshals. We're going to take the firearms and explosives element of the FBI and transfer it to ATF, and we'll deal with ATF later. We'll take the cyber part of the FBI and put it someplace else, and then we'll take the counterintelligence part and move it to a tiny little office to make that a standing separate counterintelligence service. So then you've peeled away all the layers of the FBI that are useful. You've kept all the functions with the useful people in them, but you've parceled them out so they can't get together to abuse power. And then you take a stump grinder to the rest of it.
So now you've answered the question that I alluded to at the beginning, which is when people talk about dismantling the FBI, they're not talking about dismantling the functionality, or necessarily even firing all the field officers. Because my question always was, why would you want to lose let's say you decided you're going to live in a world where you don't need these capabilities, which is preposterous.
Right.
But also you've now got all these people with all this secret information and secret and all these connections and tools acting as freelance. You've got all these people with all this power and all this network acting as freelancers. That can't be good.
No, and there's a great talent pool that's there, and there are a lot of really great motivated people, and this drives some FBI whistleblowers nuts because they've sacrificed everything to expose it. So their view, which I sympathize with, is if you're not part of the solution, you're still part of the problem. But if you're thinking that these people have the talent, they're going to do as they're told, no matter who's the FBI director. So keep them there. We need criminologists, we need detectives, we need all these technical experts who are in there. We need them. We need the linguists. So let's not just throw everything away. Let's just take it and put it in its proper parcel, because the FBI, like any agency, it's got mission creep and it keeps expanding and expanding, and Congress keeps saying, okay. So you not only parcel it out into different entities, pre-existing entities elsewhere, but you also push power down to the states and the localities where it belongs. So right now, the FBI can't function very well in states and counties and without the active help of local law enforcement. And especially in states where sheriffs have a lot of power and authority, they need the cooperation of the sheriffs. They can't function without them. But the sheriffs, as elected law enforcement officers, have the right and the constitutional duty to tell the central government to take a hike if they think it's being abusive, or to simply deny support that's requested from the central government. So the sheriffs have a lot of power. And if we took a lot of the FBI duties and push them down toward the states, and for smaller states that didn't have the resources, maybe take something out of what is now the FBI budget and send it to states in the form of block grants, you can empower the states to do a lot of the policing and investigatory work that the FBI is right now doing.
Mike, I want to schedule another conversation, because there's just too many loose ends here. You've been fantastic. Everybody buy the book. Follow Mike Waller, and we'll be talking again soon. Thank you very much.
We'll see you, Ron.